Hello, everybody, and welcome to another exciting episode of Views on View. I am Steve Edwards, the host with the face for radio and the voice for being a mime, but I'm still your host. With me today, we have our special guest coming all the way from Poland, Jakub Andrzejewski. I know I mutilated that last name, so say it again so everybody can hear it correctly.
Yeah, so it's Jakub Andrzejewski, like the full Polish name.
Andrzejewski.
But you can contact me or ask me or name basically me. Yeah, Jakub Andrzejewski. It's I think much easier for everyone.
Very good. And I think it's also worth noting that with Jakub today, we have his two cats. We have Felix and Bushka. Bushka is recovering from some recent typical feline surgery, shall we say. So she's been fixed, and so can't see her, but Felix is a very large tabby. He's a bad boy, as Jakub says. He looks good and he gets away with things because he's so good looking. And then also, as always, I'd like to welcome in our studio audience who's here to cheer us on. Yeah, the nice thing about this audience is they always cheer, they never boo. So that's why I like
whatever you say, they're cheering.
That's exactly right. It's just an amazing coincidence. So with that, we will delve into, I'm sorry, before I forget. And Jakub is coming to us from Poland. And tell us the name of your city so I don't mutilate it.
So it's Wrocław, but you can say Wrocław. It can be easier as well.
Love, as in Wrocław. Yes, he was telling me that around his city they have signs that help make clear the pronunciation for the tourists that come through so they don't mutilate the name like I just probably did.
No worries, you did great.
So today we are here to talk about performance, in particular in Nuxt and Vue. As with any JavaScript tool, I don't think it ever goes away. It's always sort of a hot topic with JavaScript frameworks, whether it's server-side stuff or whether it's SPAs that are completely in the browser just because of how they downloading JavaScript to the browser impacts speed and performance of your website. So what we're going to do is talk about performance in general. We'll talk about some of the tools that are used, and then we'll get into the specifics of some options that we have for improving performance in Vue and Nuxt. Since there's a Vue podcast, that seemed like a good thing to mention. So, Jakub, take it away.
Sure. So, talking about performance is usually a quite interesting thing to do because performance is one of those area topics or general topics about developing a modern websites, similar to concepts like accessibility, security, scalability. So this is like a concept that it's not like a Boolean value that you can just enable it and it just works out of the box. All of these things are processes. So in order to have a performant website, good performing website, what you need to do is basically take care of this performance from the very beginning of the project. So in order to have a performance store, you can just, work on your e-commerce store, let's say. You can work on it for a year without measuring or checking the performance and then going live into production with it and then verifying whether the performance is good, because then it's just too late. You have made too many changes and you have developed the whole application from scratch, and basically it's too late. So what you can do instead is utilize the culture of measuring and checking the performance from the very beginning of the project development. How to achieve that? And what are the metrics that you should take a look at, and what are the, let's say, possible improvements or improvements that can help you have a better performance in general, as well as modules and plugins. I will probably talk about more in the next parts of this podcast. So maybe I will start with something general in terms of performance. So how I understand it, how I understand this topic or this term. So considering the performance, we usually think about like the Lighthouse score. What we do is we just run the DevTools in our browser, and we are just running the Lighthouse, which is one of the tabs there. And we can just select the performance tab, and we see after a few seconds when our website was audited, the audit was conducted on this website. And we see the result. And we usually only take a look at this general overall number. And we see, for example, let's say 99, because our website is really performant. But this number can be misleading, because is 99 good, or let's say different way, is the score of 70 of performance good for blog, and is it good for e-commerce website? Because the problem here is that we have this common number that we are using to measure all types of websites, all types of web applications, when in reality those websites can work in a very different way. So basically you can have e-commerce that is fetching data from the e-commerce platform, like data about products, categories, promotions, users, and a lot of stuff. And you can have a really static blog where you have free posts or free like README files, not README, MD files, sorry, Markdown files that are then transformed into like HTML files. And is it fair to compare this e-commerce website with this blog and just say, this e-commerce is pretty slow, it has only 70 points? And to be honest, having a score of 70 in e-commerce is quite good. Like, you would like to have this kind of score, especially on mobile phones, because on mobile it's usually much, much worse. So for me, the performance is not about this magic number that I think majority of the world is now seeing as the like, is this website performant or not? So how I treat performance is usually about the users. So if the website has a good score when you are testing in locally with Lighthouse, it can have a great score. It can have 99 in every possible, let's say, conditions, right? Different pages, different devices. It can have like 99. But you have to remember that if you are doing this kind of test for this website, what you are doing is that you are using your local machine. So your like 64 gigabytes, I don't know how to pronounce this, RAM device can basically achieve a score of 100 even on a very old WordPress website without any modifications, because it has a lot of computation power or resources that it can use to load the page really, really fast. But reality is that in big projects, you usually have also those users who don't have such a good devices. They're using old phones that they might be using slow, let's say 3G connection, internet connection. And for them, what you will get is they will have much worse score, even this Lighthouse score. So what Google and let's say other folks in the web performance area always try to let's say educate is that there are two types of data, like performance data, that you can get and analyze. You have the lab data and you have the field data. So lab data is, for example, what you can get from running Lighthouse in your local environment for your project, just on your machine. This is only for your device, with your computation resources, with your like RAM, memory, and so on and so on. And this is the result. And the second one, or this lab data can be also achieved by running a Lighthouse test in the browser. This is like the second, not in the browser, but from the website, because you can also run it programmatically from the website to audit your website. So this is one type. The second type, which is called the field data. So the field data is the data that is coming from the actual users. So what Chrome is doing is they have this thing, it's called CRUX or CRUX. I think this is how Rick Viscomi is pronouncing it, which is a Chrome user experience. This is the longer version of the shortcut, let's say, shorthand. So what it does, it is storing the data about different web applications that is retrieved from the real users who are accessing this website. So basically what it means is that with this CRUX, what you get is the data from the real users. So real users who are accessing your website and what is their actual performance, not the performance that you are doing with the auditing tool, like with Lighthouse, locally or through the, let's say, under the website, is how your users are experiencing your website. So this is, I would say that whenever you can, use the field data. This is more appropriate for the users who are using your website than the lab data. But this is not only about this single number, like the overall performance score, because there are also several metrics that you can use, you can use basically to validate whether your website is performant or not. So you have things like Core Web Vitals, and I'm sure that majority of the audience will know what I'm talking about. You have things like largest contentful paint, you have cumulative layout shift, CLS, and other things as well. And those metrics, they are not single number like 70, 80, 99. They are values in seconds, or they are also numeric values in some cases that are selected by Google after a lot of research on modern websites, how they behave, how much time does it take them to load certain elements. So if we take, for example, at the largest contentful paint, so as its name suggests, it's this main element on your page, on your homepage. How much time does it take for this element to be loaded? So if you have a lot of scripts, if you have a lot of things that are blocking the requests for this particular image, you will have worse score, and also your users will have worse scores or worse perceived performance, basically. If we take a look at CLS, it's about the stability of your website. It's not, I would say it's not as related to the performance in general, but more about the experience of using the website. Because there are many examples of bad CLS when you have this homepage and you click on the, let's say, checkout button or cart button, and then the ad appears and is moving the whole page down, and you click on the ad instead of the cart. So we know examples such as this one. So CLS shows us those kind of issues, how stable our website is when it is first loading. So this one is not as about performance as largest contentful paint, but it's quite useful to have or to deliver better experience, to the real users. So we know about the performance, we know about metrics, we know what we should look for in terms of the metrics, like field data versus lab data. So what tools we can use to measure the performance? So we know already about the Lighthouse. I mentioned it, and I'm sure that all of the audience will know about Lighthouse. It's very simple tool to use. We just click audit and we see the result in the browser. We don't have to go anywhere else. But Lighthouse gives you only the results that are coming from your website, from your device, sorry. So you are doing this audit locally and you just see the result. Don't get me wrong, Lighthouse is a really great tool and you should be using it because it delivers many useful information about your website. Like, apart from just the numbers, about the general performance result, about certain vitals, what you get as well is things like diagnostics and opportunities. So these kind of things are usually the things that you should fix or are considered to be things that could improve your performance. So basically, by running this Lighthouse test, even locally, what you get is a sort of checklist of how you can make your website more performant. And I believe that it's really good developer experience and you should be using that. However, as I mentioned, you shouldn't be treating this as a single source of truth, more like one of the tools that could give you some knowledge and some data. But there are also other tools that I'm using on a daily basis. And one of them is PageSpeed Insights. So PageSpeed Insights is using Lighthouse under the hood, and it's also using this CRUX, like cracks. So it is combining both data, both lab data and field data in one, let's say, report, so that you can see the difference between the data from Lighthouse. So the data about your website that was, let's say, audited, or the audit was conducted on the website in an isolated environment. And in the opposite, you can get the data from the real users. And there were many interesting scenarios there, because for some of, for example, of our clients in VUE, the company that I work for, we had cases like the result on the lab data, so in Lighthouse in an isolated environment, was, let's say, 60, 70, and for the real users it was like 80 or 90. So this shows that majority of the users who are accessing this website basically have very good devices. So they don't have to take care that much about supporting like slow mobile devices. And in the other case, what we had an interesting problem with was that in the lab data, the CLS, so the stability of the website, was the value of this metric was 0, which means that the website is static, there is no movement at all. And because of that, and in the lab data, in the field data, sorry, there was like 20 or 30, like this magic number. So it shows that there is some movement. So we started figuring out what could happen, because in an isolated environment, the website is stable, like it's static, it doesn't move. And for the real users, it was moving for some reason. So we started trying to figure out what could be the issue, whether this is some kind of web plugins that are causing this kind of switch or shift. And unfortunately, we haven't found an answer for that. And the next result of the CRUX shown that this error disappeared. So partly we are happy because there is no more error, but partly we are also unhappy because we haven't fixed it. So it can probably appear one more time in the future. So we have tools like Lighthouse and PageSpeed Insights, but there are also many, many more tools like web page test, like speed curve. There's a lot of tools that are much more advanced and will give you much more data that you can analyze and see where in what cases your application is failing in terms of performance. So those ones are more advanced. So from the very beginning, I would recommend to try Lighthouse and PageSpeed Insights, because they will do their work and you will have at least some feedback about your performance. But this is something that you should be using on the website that is already running, like in production. PageSpeed Insights, unless you are using some kind of API, you have to use on a publicly available website. So it has to be deployed, it has to be in production. Lighthouse, you can use even on your local environment. You are starting your development server and you just run Lighthouse from your browser. So you can have in local environment and in the browser. However, there are also other scenarios where you can analyze the performance as well, which will help you achieve this more or less performant website. And one of the ideas that came to my mind in terms of having this additional layer of performance auditing was to actually implement the CI/CD, like continuous integration, continuous delivery process in Nuxt.js by using Lighthouse. So how it works is basically you have this npm package called LHCI. I hope that I pronounce it correctly. So it's Lighthouse CI. And how it works is it works as a command line. So you just run LHCI run, or I don't exactly remember the command, but I think it's run. And you just pass it a configuration file where you specify what page you would like to audit, what device you would like to use for this audit, how many runs you would like to take, like let's say 3, and the average and the score will be like average of 3 results. And you have many more of configuration options there. And what it will do is it will do a Lighthouse test from your command line. So you will just receive the result in your terminal, basically. So what I've thought about is that in order to have this process of continuous, let's say, performance auditing, this is how I call it, is you can implement it from the very beginning of the project development, like one of the first steps. You generate a Vue or Nuxt project, and the next thing you do is you add this LHCI package to your project. You add this GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket CI script that allows you to perform or conduct performance auditing with this Lighthouse package after each pull request, after each push to the main branch, so that after doing this, you get the results, basically, whether this new PR, for example, new pull request broke something, or whether it's better for performance. So these are one of the, let's say, solutions on how you can have this continuous performance auditing.
Yeah, I'll jump in here for a minute. I'll give your voice a rest there for a second. I'll point out that, yeah, what you're describing is, I think a fairly standard setup in terms of using continuous integration to run your tests for you when you commit. In my day-to-day, we manage a fairly large Vue/Laravel app, and that's how we have it set up with Circle CI, in that it's connected to the GitHub repos. And so whenever we push to the repo, whether it's a new branch, whether it's an existing branch, whatever, it has to run through all of our tests. And we have a whole bunch of tests that are, front end tests as well as unit tests for the back end code. And then in order for the code to be deployed, wherever the situation may be, either whether it's to prod or whether to a staging site, all the tests have to pass. And I'm sure that's configurable in the CI/CD. I wasn't the one who set it up. I'm not much of a DevOps guy myself, but that way you make sure that you're not deploying anything that's failing tests, because if it's going to fail your tests, then more than likely it's going to fail for a user too. So yeah, this is a pretty standard setup and very useful in that it does it for you automatically, and you don't have to go into your command line and say, okay, run these tests and then do it. So anyway.
So I would say that it should, performance auditing should be a process developed in your project from the very beginning, the same as unit tests, like end-to-end tests, like pre-tier, SLint, things that basically are doing work for you. You don't have to. The only thing you have to do is to fix the issue when it appears. So if you have this kind of continuous integration implemented from the very beginning, you have things like SLint and pre-tier, so code styling, having the same, let's say, linting settings for the whole project, so every developer is developing the code the same way. You have pre-tier, I mentioned already pre-tier. You have unit tests, you have end-to-end tests, so it is checking whether maybe something changed in your application, and from now on, this one, let's say, function or method is failing. So as you mentioned, it can fail for you, and it will most probably fail for the user who is using this functionality. So it's the same for performance auditing. If you have this kind of CI process, you will know before deploying to production or deploying a new branch that something is failing. Of course, this is not 100% correct. You might have some false positives for that, but it's better to warn you and just check it out and discover that it wasn't correct, than the opposite way. So believing that everything is perfect and then figuring out that it's really bad and you have to do re-engineering from scratch and going backward 3 months. So this is my summary.
Let me ask you this. Mm-hmm. Let me ask you this question real quick before we go farther. With front-end testing, end-to-end testing, as you call it, Playwright, a Dusk, Cypress, whatever, right? You've written your tests. Okay, I want this to do here, and I push this button, it goes to this page. I expect to see this text. If I click this button, then I go, so on. So you have, and then your test, you say, I look for specific things, and if this text isn't here in this place, then it's a failed test, right? And the same thing with unit testing, where, okay, I'm running this function, and I expect this value to be returned here. It should be an array with so many items, whatever the case is, right? Mm-hmm. Those are pretty, I don't know what the term is I'm looking for, fixed criteria. Performance testing seems to me it would be a little more ambiguous, right? So I guess my question is, how do you set standards for something like this to tell you that something's failed or that something passed? Is it, it's a 70 Lighthouse score, maybe, or it's a certain score on the Crux tests, or how do you determine what's a failed test? And I'm sure it's going to be very subjective, depending upon the developer, the site, the tools that are being used. Mm-hmm. Correct.
So, very good question. I wanted to talk about it, but in a few minutes from now. So basically, with things like Lighthouse, you can set something what is called performance budget, or budgeting in general. And these are the set of values that you define, and whenever the result is, let's say, below certain value that you define in the performance budget, this action will fail. So it's something like with tests. If you write a test and it doesn't match, like the expected value is not, the received value is not the same as expected value, you are failing the test. In here, the expected value is, let's say, largest contentful paint below 2.5 seconds. This is like considered very good, or very good in Core Web Vitals. So you set this performance budget for largest contentful paint to be no more than 2.5 seconds. So whenever a test is being conducted, and the result is bigger, let's say 3 seconds, this test will fail and will show you, okay, in this pull request, the largest contentful paint is worse than previously. Of course, this can be a matter of, I would say, outside involvement. I'm not sure the word in English, but let's say that you have this test that is being conducted, and the machine or the machine where this test is conducted can be affected by traffic or by different tests and so on and so on. So this result might not be like 100% correct. So what we do to have this score better or more, let's say, correct, is we do multiple tests at the same time. So we can configure this Lighthouse CI to tell him, okay, you will do the performance auditing for this website, and you will take this performance budget that I'm sending you from the configuration file, and I want you to do, let's say, 5 tests and get the average from them. And if the average is above 2.5 seconds, there is a probability that something was broken in this PR, and we should take a look at it. So this is how we are working with performance budgeting to have this kind of assertions for performance auditing with tools like Lighthouse, for example. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, no, that perfectly. Yeah, that answers it. I figured it had to be something like that. That's interesting that I hadn't thought about that, where you take average from multiple tests and put them together as compared to hard and fast. Okay, if it passed this and it didn't pass this, it's failing.
So right now, maybe I will switch to the second part of the topic that I wanted to talk about, is to get away a bit from the performance and move into my favorite framework, which is Nuxt.js. What I do in Nuxt.js is I am an ambassador and insider. So it means there are 2 different terms for Nuxt. Ambassador is the content creator, while the insider is like contributor. So someone who can contribute to the core framework, is developing the modules that you can use for your upcoming Nuxt application, and so on and so on. So I really, when I first heard that there are plans for Nuxt Free, I'm sure that majority of the users right now is using Nuxt Free because of the developer experience, because of the Vite support, which is fast out of the box, and so on and so on. But I came from the world of Nuxt 2, and especially very slow Nuxt 2 applications. So when I first heard about Nuxt Free, which was really fast out of the box, I instantly fell in love with it. And I was like working with it from the time when it was first published, like the not even like release candidate version, but those first public versions of Nuxt Free, which means that almost every module and every aspect of the framework wasn't working. So you had to figure out things by yourself. And what is especially intriguing and interesting for me in terms of Nuxt is that throughout I think there was like 14 release candidates, I think, for the Nuxt Free. I developed a Nuxt module before there was the RC1 announced. So in the wild times of not even an RC version of Nuxt. And since then, to the RC14 and actually the stable 3.0 version of Nuxt, I only needed to do one change, which was basically change between private runtime config to runtime config.private. So the change was like one liner. And I was so amazed that the guys from Nuxt, like from the core team, managed to do things like this in a matter of 14 release candidates of the stable version of Nuxt. So it's amazing stuff. Like, kudos to the core team and for Daniel, for Puya.
Yeah, we've had Daniel Rowe on here 2 or 3 times, I think, over the past year to talk about Nuxt 3, him and another guy named Drew Baker, who's a big Nuxt user at his agency at Funkhouse. So yeah, if you want they really got into the nitty gritty of some of the performance. I think Nitro is the engine, if I remember correctly.
Yeah,
that
exactly.
They're using in Nuxt. So yeah, we can put those episodes in the show notes, but they really got into the nitty gritty of these performance improvements in Nuxt and how they work behind the scenes. And it went way over my head because I'm not a big Nuxt user, but it was good stuff if you're really into that.
Yeah. So now I would like to talk a bit about what you can do or what you should take into consideration in terms of performance in Vue and Nuxt apps. So what I find like the biggest issue in modern front-end development, and also coincidentally, I don't know. Coincidentally, yeah, exactly. Yeah, this is the correct word. So what I find especially interesting is that the biggest problem, and at the same time, in my opinion, the easiest to fix, are the images. Because let's say you are a full stack developer, so you have access to both the database and the CSS. So as a developer, you usually think, okay, so if I want to have a better performing website, I need to do some more optimized, SQL queries, or implement some kind of, Elasticsearch for having a very fast key value pairs, just to have faster searches or finding the right record faster. So you usually think of performance improvements such as this one. However, in majority of the websites, I would say that the bad performance is not actually coming from the backend itself. Of course, there are cases that the bad performance might come from poorly developed backend, like connecting 20 times to database instead of one. I'm sure we know examples such as this one, production ready examples. However, I would say that, okay, maybe not majority, but let's say often, and there are cases such as this one. So the problem can be caused by the images. And what I mean by the images is not the fact that they are there, it's the fact that we are using them in a not performant way. So let's say that we have a website. So we have a header, and then below it we have, let's say, a banner with some kind of image and the text, like the heading. And below that we have, let's say, a footer with some kind of images. Let's say images. In the footer we have 3 people and the images of their faces, and this is our team. Let's say something like this. So imagine that we are fetching this website, like loading it. And what is happening is that because those images in the footer are in the source of this particular website, they are fetched at the load time because we need them to basically display them. But if you think from the user's perspective, do I really need those footer images from the very first load? I don't think so, because I will need them when I scroll down because they're at the footer, and most probably the footer won't be like in my viewport, so what I will see at first time. So what I usually recommend to use is the technique called lazy loading images. So how it works is basically you can have the images, and if you are using tools like Lozat.js, for example, or even native lazy attribute of the image tag in HTML, what you can do is you can defer sending this request for the image until the time that this image will be in the viewport. So the users will see it, and then the request will be sent for the image. You might be surprised, but the performance improvements caused let's say caused by implementing lazy loading for the images that are below default can greatly improve the performance, both perceived and in the score, because basically you are not sending requests for the content that you basically don't need. However, you have to be quite cautious with it, because lazy loading images is very useful tool and you should be using it. However, make sure to not use it every time. Like I mentioned metrics such as largest contentful paint. So the biggest element on your homepage or on your website that should be fetched from the very beginning. You have to add a priority to it so that this image is loaded as fast as possible. So what happens if you add a lazy attribute, like loading lazy attribute to this element that is supposed to be lazy largest contentful paint? How it works is this image or the request for getting this image will be actually moved to the bottom of the let's say requests stack. I don't know if that makes that name makes sense, but basically the hierarchy of the requests. So instead of fetching this resource as fast as possible, ASAP, we are basically moving it to the very end, which will cause your website to be loaded much slower. And I mentioned also images, and it's not only about lazy loading them, it's also about the format. Few years ago, using formats such as WebP wasn't, let's say, secure, because there was still a thing like Internet Explorer. I'm very happy that it's. I'm not sure if it's dying or died already. I've heard that it's supposed to be like deactivated, but I'm not sure if it was done already or will it be done until the end of the year. No matter, I'm just happy that it won't be there with us anymore. However, I would say that Safari, the native macOS browser, is becoming a second version or the next version of Internet Explorer for some of the functionalities that are there out of the box. So
yeah, I've heard that argument made quite a bit. Safari is becoming the next IE6. And I think for a while it was. I do know from what I've been seeing, there's a guy named Jen Simmons who has taken over. I don't know what her role is specifically. I can't remember, at Safari with Apple. But she's done quite a bit. I know she's doing quite a bit of work on trying to get Safari caught up. And so hopefully things will be getting better with her. I just remember her from when I was in the Drupal community years ago. She's always a big design person. So from what I can tell, she's trying to get Safari caught up, and hopefully they'll be doing that here pretty soon.
Hopefully. I just, in my previous company, I was developing an e-commerce website where I think 80% of the users were using Internet Explorer, So imagine in 2000 and was it 21, I think, developing for the Internet Explorer.
Ugh.
Like
corporations or maybe government entities, or somebody who is really a Microsoft shop, they would be roped into using that, and they've got custom stuff written for Internet Explorer, or excuse me, Explorer. Microsoft pretty much disavows it anymore, Internet Explorer. So I've been in places like that where they're tied into using Microsoft browsers, and it was unfortunate, but that's the users really don't have much choice. It's the higher ups that make that decision, but that explains some of that use that you see, or maybe used to see.
Yeah. So what I wanted to say from the very beginning is that we have those image formats that are basically lighter while they deliver the same image. So if you have, let's say, PNG or JPEG, those images can be easily transformed into another format, for example, WebP, which is more performant. And even right now, I think there is AVIF, also another format, but I'm not sure if it's supported everywhere. I think WebP is like safe, that will work in Chrome, Firefox, and other browsers. However, AVIF, I think, doesn't have yet full support. So I think you can safely bet for WebP. And of course, you cannot always just, convert your image into WebP. Sometimes you're fetching images from a different source, from CMS or from e-commerce. So you can't really just say, okay, I will now use WebP, because those images stored there are, for example, PNG. So what you can do is you can use tools like Cloudinary, for example, which is the digital asset management.
Digital,
or DAM.
Yes.
Digital, okay. And how it works is basically you can store the images there, or you can send a request to Cloudinary, and in response, you will receive a optimized image. Different format, maybe some optimizations, or maybe even some transformations, grayscale, rounded corners, whatever. Cloudinary will do it for you. So you can use stuff like that. And in a Vue or in the Nuxt world, you have also one of my most favorite modules to use with Nuxt. And I even created, let's say, some sort of a Twitter poll about the most used Nuxt modules. And I stated there that for me, like in my new projects, what I usually use is I use the Tailwind module for styling, of course, and the image module, because almost everywhere you will deal with images. And being able to deliver them in a performant way is really crucial, no matter if you are building a blog or a portfolio page or e-commerce website. You always want to have the most or the best performing images. So with the Nuxt image, you don't need to use the Cloudinary. You can use it. There is one of the providers support is Cloudinary, so you can use it without any issues. However, you can also use the built-in IPX. I don't know the full name of it, but it's like the local image optimizer that you can use to optimize those images on the fly. So you can fetch the image from, let's say, e-commerce platform to your Nuxt application. And with Nuxt image, you can optimize it and, let's say, change its format to WebP so that it's lighter and it's easier for the browser to load. So this is one of the key performance improvements that I'm recommending to anyone, basically.
Yeah. If you're before we go on, I'll jump in here. So there's, one of the jokes I've heard before from other web developers on another podcast was that you have these people that will work on their performance, right? And they've got their JavaScript bundled, right? And they're working on all these things. And then they'll download a huge image, that takes forever to download, and it's huge, and just sort of squash on all your, on all your other performance improvements, because you made all this improvements, and then you then it takes forever just to download this image that you've got in there. So now in terms of Cloudinary is probably one of the more popular or well-known image services that does that. And they're pretty cool because what allows you to do is upload your image there. And I've used it on a project before. And then using URL parameters, when you fetch your image, you can tell it, okay, I want it this length, and I want it this width, and I want it in this format, and I want you to crop it this much and resize it and do all this stuff. And you just tell that with URL, things like URL parameters. So that way it allows you to dynamically fetch. You could fetch the same image in 3 different ways, depending on whether you want it sized for like an icon on the left or a banner image or just an image in a blog post or something like that. And then some of the CMSs will incorporate, whether it's Cloudinary or maybe other services that do the same thing. And they'll incorporate it in there. So anytime you use an image, then it handles, you just have to put in your parameters, and behind the scenes, it integrates with such and such a service. The one that comes to mind, one of the first headless CMSs I used was called Butter CMS. And they had a service integrated. It starts with an I, image something, I can't remember what it is, but it handles that for you. So that's just an awesome, it's a great tool to have in that you're not handling the storage of the images. You don't have to make space on your servers and take up server space. And, you're just paying for, depending on how much of a free tier they might have and how small your project is. But there are a number of them out there. I just did some quick Googling and found blog post that gives a whole bunch of other services that are very similar to Cloudinary, whether it's thing as simple as Dropbox. There's one called Black Hole, File Stack, Pocket Base, even AWS Amplify. So there's lots of them out there. But anyway, so that's my my speech on images there.
Sure. So this is what I'm recommending to anyone, basically. Just think of the images first. And of course, there are other optimizations and performance improvements you can have. You can have things like delayed hydration, because Nuxt, by default, if you're using SSR apps, like server-side rendered, how it works, it's sending HTML to the browser, and then it's hydrating it with JavaScript. So with delayed hydration, what you can achieve is that you can take control of this hydration and decide whether or when to hydrate certain part. So let's say that you have a button that will do some logic when you click on it. You can lazy hydrate it so that it will be hydrated with JavaScript on interaction. So when user clicks it. This is one of the examples of using the delayed or lazy hydration. It's quite similar concept to lazy loading. Basically, don't fetch the code or don't use the code that is not necessary for the time being, for the time when user is seeing something. What is next is I will basically go through the modules. I just opened up my Nuxt performance series on Dev2. If you'd like to check it out, it's basically you will type Nuxt performance and you will see one of my articles. So we have things like delayed hydration. We have things like one of the tools that actually Daniel Rowe created, which is called Fontaine. And what this tool does is it's using the font, I believe it's called font override. Basically, when you are using a custom font, sometimes you might see the layout shift based off the font. So by default, you will get the default device font. Like on macOS or Windows, you will have different default browser fonts. And then when the font will be fetched, this font will be replaced. And usually it can cause some kind of ACLS, like cumulative layout shift. So by using Fontaine, what it does, it is using the font override. I hope that I name it correctly. If not, shame on me. But this tool is really great and basically doesn't need any configuration whatsoever. It's developed as it's called unplugging, so it works the same way for Vite, for Webpack, and for ES modules, I think. So you'll download this plugin, and it will work for any build tool that you can use today, and it will add this font face rule automatically to your code. So you don't need to do anything. You just install it, and you are making sure that this CLS caused by the font change won't be as troublesome, let's say. What you can get as well is you can, for example, I think majority of bigger websites are using things like analytics or any other third-party script, that when you are seeing the Google Analytics or Plausible or any other third-party script you're checking the official docs, what they say to you is, hey, just copy this script and put it in your website. Of course, is the easiest way to do it, but the fact that they are showing it from the very first, like, getting started guide or whatever, for me, it's like the big no, because, okay, this is the fastest way, but it's also causing you to have problems later on, because you will have those issues with, for example, Google Analytics, that you will have to fetch the whole script so that your page can basically load and behave. So with PartyTown, what you get is that you can move the execution of the script to the web worker, so it doesn't block the main thread of fetching and let's say creating your website. So you can have the functionality of Google Analytics without it blocking the execution of the script and basically creating your website. Quite useful stuff, developed by Builder.io.
Yeah, I mean, that's the problem you're going to have. I mean, with any remote downloading of JavaScript, it's one more thing to download and run in your page. No matter how much it's been minified or improved in its structure, it's JavaScript that you got to download. And what's interesting is, Google. I know for a long time, Google Analytics was, the way to get analytics on traffic to your website. And now there are other options. I know, for instance, if you're using Netlify, which is a well-known hosting service, especially for Nuxt. I know I've used it for Nuxt sites in the past. They have stuff that are like server-based analytics, which are probably going to be more accurate, I think. But that way, it's just running on the server, and you're not having to load additional JavaScript in your page just to measure your traffic. So there are other options, but yeah, Google Analytics is probably one of the first and probably the most well-known tool for measuring site traffic.
So one final note from my side in terms of both general performance and performance in Vue and Nuxt. Just take example of laziness, concept like lazy hydration, lazy loading, lazy code splitting, and lazy loading modules, and so on, and just think of it as, if you don't need it, don't ship it. It's very simple rule. If you don't need this code, just don't ship it. Make it code split it, like your application per root or per page. Make things like lazy hydration, lazy loading. Just if you don't need it, or the user does not need it from the very beginning or from the first second, just don't ship it. The best code is the one that you don't need to write.
Exactly. Yeah, definitely more of an issue for browser side versus server side, right? Server side, you can probably get away with writing some extra code, a little more than in your browser, because it's running before the content even gets to your browser.
Yeah,
cool.
I think so.
So we talked about Fontaine and image. Right. Is there any other Nuxt performance modules or tips before we head to picks?
I would say there's one, but I'm not sure if it's like still being used. It's like the Critters module. So Critters is the tool developed by Google that allows you to include the critical CSS in your inline like HTML in the head, so that it's loaded as fast as possible. So I know about this one. And I think that's all from my side in terms of the, at least for the articles. I'm sure there are many other approaches. I've seen the module from Daniel Rowe about Zero.js that allows you to completely remove all JavaScript from your Nuxt application, which might be useful for the static websites, but basically won't work for e-commerce. But it's also, there are a lot of concepts that we can utilize the modern website. Recently also developed server components, which are rendered on the server, and the change is actually caused and it's delivered as a request to the backend, to the underlying server, and then sending as a result the updated value, so that you don't have basically any JavaScript on the front end. You just have it on the backend, and then you send the request, the change is being done there, and you just receive a new result, let's say a counter. You click on a button, and then you send the request, and then you, as a return, you get the new counter value, like +1, something like this. So there are many concepts, and the ones I talked about here today were just the ones that I'm using, let's say, every day, and I'm finding them especially useful.
Awesome. So I realized that one of the things I forgot to ask you at the beginning was tell us about yourself a little bit, who you are and why you're famous and that kind of stuff. So before we move on, can you give us a little background on what you're doing there in Poland, who you work for, and how you got into VUE Nuxt, I guess?
Sure. I'm not famous yet. Just to clear this.
Well, you will be
out.
After this. You will be after this, right?
I'm sure. So yeah, and I work at VUE Storefront, and I work as a full stack developer. So I'm doing from coding from SQL and databases to CSS, which brings me the most joy. And apart from this, what I do is I'm a frequent contributor mainly to Nuxt. That's why I'm also an ambassador and the insider there. I'm also an ambassador for Storyblok and Algolia. I developed a module for Nuxt that allows you to very easily connect to Algolia. And for Storyblok, this is my go-to in terms of using headless CMSs. I just like the experience. I like the guys who work there, because we are meeting on almost every conference. So there is a good connection, let's say. And finally, I'm also a Google developer expert in web performance from December last year. So not so much, not too long, let's say. That's why awesome. the interest in web performance.
Yeah, I had seen your stuff on VUE Storefront as well, and I was going to ask you about that, but that sounds like it's a whole bigger topic. We might have to have you come back and talk about VUE Storefront. Can you just give us, before we go, a real brief description of what VUE Storefront is? I mean, the name sort of gives it away, but if there's any more details you can tell.
Sure. So VUE Storefront is a front-end platform, I would call it, for headless e-commerce. So headless e-commerce or headless commerce is when you have your e-commerce website and you have the storefront, which is basically a front end, and the e-commerce platform, which is a backend. They are separated from each other. So you can have, you can use e-commerce platforms as Shopify, BigCommerce, Commerce Tools, Magento, and they are completely separate from your storefront, from the front end. So VUE Storefront is actually this storefront part, but it's not only about displaying data from e-commerce platform, because apart from just doing this, you also get integrations with stuff like CMSs, payment gateways, search engines. So that's why it's called platform. It's not just the front end, it's more like a platform that you can use it, and basically you get like the full experience of modern e-commerce website. So you have the storefront with the e-commerce data, you have the CMS with dynamically fetched data about the content, you have search results from Algolia, for example, and many more. So that's why it's called platform, not front end, not just front end.
Awesome.
Brief overview.
Yes, yeah. Looks we might have to talk more about that. That's fascinating. All righty. So with all of that, we will move on to picks. Picks are the part of the program where we get to talk about something other than tech if we want to, whether it could be books or movies, or in my case, dad jokes. So I'll start out today and go right to the dad jokes of the week. So I gotta find my list here real quick. I was in the wrong room. So this morning, or not this morning, I was too busy this morning. The other day, I went to a store, and it was a plagiarism store. But I tried to pay in cash, but they would only take credit. Right, take credit for other people's stuff. Right.
That's good one. That's a really good one.
Yeah. So here's a deep thought, a question, and the answer might not be so obvious. If rubber comes from rubber trees and sugar comes from sugar canes, where does chicken come from? From pole trees. That's POUL, not POLE. And then finally, in the past, I've talked about some of the various jobs that I've had and reasons I got fired. Like I lost my job as a bus driver because I gave a lady my seat on the bus trying to be nice. But I once had a job making plastic Draculas, if you've ever seen those. Unfortunately, there were only 2 of us on the production line, so I had to make every second count. Right? That's every other count. So thank you. Those are my jokes of the week.
They were really good ones.
Thank you. I have a high bar when it comes to my dad jokes that I tell. There are many out there that I won't tell, but I try to select the best. So what do you have for us? Any picks, Jacob?
Yeah, I think so. Not related to tech. Something that I got into a few months ago, which is Dungeons and Dragons. So this kind of role-playing game where you are meeting with a group of friends, and basically you are, as its name suggests, you are playing certain roles. But I haven't started it as... I have started playing this few years ago as a member. However, a few months ago, I started to join the sessions as the so-called Dungeon Master. So the Dungeon Master is a person that is actually creating a story, is responsible for all the mechanics that are going on, so combat, some kind of ability checks, things like that, and also about taking the players through the story. So it is especially interesting experience for me because I have never been such a, let's say, creative guy. I never really knew how to draw cool stuff, paint, sing, dance, or whatever. I'm not this kind of creative guy. So becoming a dungeon master where you can't be prepared for everything, because you can have a schedule or a plan where you will take the players. You will take them to, let's say, a dungeon or a castle or somewhere else. But there is absolutely no way that you will predict what they will do. And I managed to find this out on my very first session where I started as a dungeon master, where I have told the players, guys, you are on a ship and you are sailing to place X, doesn't matter. And I wanted this ship to be a so-called resting place for the players, so that they will start to interact with each other and just to know better their surrounding. And the first thing one of the players did was to run to the top of the ship and just find the guy who was on the top and ask him some questions. And in the Dungeons and Dragons, the Dungeon Master is role-playing each character that the players are meeting on the journey. So I had to create the story in my head in like half a second and just continue with it because the player was really intrigued what he will know from this guy on the top of the ship. And so I had to create this story on the go, just trying to basically create things from the top of my head. And eventually it was very interesting for that player to listen what I had what I wanted to tell him. And I managed to create such a interesting story, even though I made everything up and I wasn't prepared for it. And the story itself wasn't even connected to the scenario that was prepared for this session. It was completely out of the box. But still, what matters is the fun that both me and the player had. Even though it wasn't scripted, I wasn't prepared for it. I just went with the flow, and he and also the other players there, they really liked it. And this is what is the best for the Dungeon Master, is when both you and the players are having fun. So my pick...
Yeah, that takes some creativity that I certainly don't have. You know, I've had friends that many friends that played it when I was growing up, you know, back in the 80s, and the game is obviously, you know, continued and still around, but that kind of creativity where you can tell a story off the top of your head is, yeah, you wouldn't want me as the dungeon master. Let's just put it that way.
Steve, I said the same. And look where I'm here right now. I'm doing a dungeon master. So if I can do it, I'm sure you can do it as well.
Okay, well, I'll take your word for it for now. Alrighty, so with that, we will wrap up this episode of Views on Vue. Before we go, Jakub, if people want to get a hold of you or follow all your words of wisdom or even give you money, what's the best place to do that?
I would say the Twitter. I'm the most active there. It's at Jakub Andrzejewski, without any underscores, slashes, and so on. It's just at Jakub Andrzejewski. And of course on GitHub, where I'm publishing most of my open source work. And there is a difference because on GitHub I'm called at Baroshem with B. BAROSHAM. It's difficult to say that in English. So Baroshem.
Okay, and we will put those links in the show notes so that you don't have to try to remember that spelling or be writing it down as the podcast goes on. All right, well, thank you to Felik and Busha for coming as well and joining us. And also, before we leave, I'd like to say thank you to the studio audience. Thank you, people. Always a pleasure to have you here. Thank you for coming. And with that, we will wrap it up. Thank you, Jakub. And we will talk to everybody next time.